the land of milk and honey. So when I say this, I always think about if you're dairy-free or lactose intolerant, don't worry, it's just a metaphor. Also, if you are having blood sugar issues or you're diabetic, it's all right. It's just a metaphor. Don't worry. I'm sure there were other dietary options in a land of milk and honey. So since I'm on the humorous note, why did the honey jar make an appointment to see the rabbi? Because it was in a sticky situation. Now, you know I get this humor from my kids. This is kid jokes. So. On a more serious note, as we read this passage, the actions of the Israelites in the story really determined the fate of the entire generation of all those who came out of Egypt. This is a very dramatic story. It's one of the really pivotal stories, actually. One of those moments where people's decisions make a huge difference in what God does. If you think about it, think about this story, this moment in history. So many pages in Tanakh are dedicated to revisiting this moment because of how pivotal it was. Now, I'm not going to talk today about the aftermath of what happened, the mistake that people made, not wanting to go into the land. Instead, I will focus on just a couple of verses just before that, what happened just before that. And hopefully the Most High will speak to us through those words. So, to make the story really short and sweet, the 10 spies who came back from Canaan were 4 against going in, doubting. 2 were for. Remember that story? Everyone remembers it. Now, when Joshua and Caleb spoke up, and they were deliberating this moment, when they spoke up, their faith shined brightly to me. And they implored people in the book of Numbers. And these are the words that they said. And these words are the ones that I want to focus on. They said, Im chafetz banu Adonai. If Hashem delights in us. Or if he's pleased with us. You can translate it like that. It says, V'heviatanu ala aretz chazot. He will bring us into this land. So they're discussing about this land of Israel that's been promised to them. And then they continue, V'natna lanu eretz asher hiva zevat chalav udvash. And he will give us this land which flows with milk and honey. And then they added one more thing in verse 9 that I really want to stress as well, because you can't go without that. In verse 9 they said, Ach b'Adonai al timrodu ve'atem al tirau. Do not rebel against Hashem. And do not fear them. And by them, they mean the local populations. So these are the words of encouragement that Caleb and Joshua, as the minority, spoke to the sons of Israel. And I know some of you sometimes ask me when I read a passage and I deliberately quote a few of those words in Hebrew, because to me, the translations, they don't always capture what Torah actually says. There's a lot of feel in Hebrew when you read it. And the way the phrases are put together, just the grammar sometimes, that's what speaks to me. And so as a result, that's why I can stand here before you and share what it is that I saw this time that I was reading these words that struck me and impressed upon me to share this with you. So let me share how this practical advice, this charge that Joshua and Caleb are the 2 spies who are a minority are giving, how some principles can play out in our lives even today, and how they can guide us even now. So we are talking about these sticky situations, and this is one of them. Standing in front of a very pivotal decision for them, and for us, a lot of times, standing in front of pivotal decisions, that's what we do. Sometimes we have to face some difficult choices. They're not easy. And there are many stories in Torah that actually inspire us about these types of scenarios. I don't know if you can think about how many hard choices and hard situations there are in Torah. Torah is filled with these moments of making the right decisions. Why do you think it is so? so that we can learn how to make these decisions, so that for us, we have some guidance. And this is one of these stories. So I realize that as I think about all of us sitting in this room, some of us have hard decisions, maybe even today. And quite often, some of us are just facing them right now. We would like to know what to do, where to go. I realize that as we make tough calls in life, we face doubt. We encounter fear. We perceive danger. Makes us very fearful sometimes. Sometimes we anticipate pain, suffering. We anticipate possible failure as we consider these pivotal decisions. We wonder a lot of times whether we have what it takes to actually succeed. We don't act because we don't feel like we will be successful. We struggle in our faith. I think we all do. Sometimes we struggle trusting the promises that God gave to us, although He actually never fails. Yet we still struggle. That's just us, human beings, no different than Israelites of old. Verse 8 says, I want you to notice, and that's why I read this in Hebrew. Verse 8 says that Hashem will bring, Vehevi otanu, He will bring Israel into the land. This is kind of how the verse is broken up. And then after that, the Torah adds that He will give, Venatnat lanu, to the land of milk and honey to Israel. So He will bring, and then He will give that land of honey. Now, the bring verb is pretty straightforward, but the verb give in Hebrew is just a tiny bit broader than it is in English. I realize in English it's kind of an action of handing someone something, right, to give. That's kind of how we understand it. Well, in Hebrew it's more encompassing. It often means to appoint. Sometimes it means to set or to establish, or sometimes it even means to add. So think of that fuller meaning of the verb give and rethink some of the familiar verses that you've read where that shows up. So what I'm leading you to is that first, God leads you into the land, and then He makes it so that it can become the land of milk and honey. There's a process. And these could be actually two separate events, and sometimes they don't actually happen that way. Thus, my first point to you this morning is this. God will lead you to good things, but the milk and honey part, well, that depends on you. Think about it. The children of Israel, Bnei Israel, were promised the land of their own. And based on the reports, what we read in the Torah, what they scouted was good land. It was fruitful, land with great potential. And that is how it is for us today. Think about your lives. God gives us all kinds of things. He gives us talents, education, opportunities, relationships, houses, jobs, etc., etc., etc. Fill in the blank. All these things that Hashem kind of makes it happen for us sometimes. What we do with them depends whether it's going to be milk or honey or none of those things. We have great potential. What we do with it is kind of up to us. And there's only one way to make sure that you will have milk and honey. But there's many ways to arrive at something entirely different. And the story gives us a big hint right here as we read it. If we hold our hearts correctly, what we hold in our hearts will determine whether the milk and honey will be there, actually. So a lot of it has to do on our attitude that is inside of our hearts. Which brings me to my second point. Great potential, my friends, is ruined by rebellion and fear. Which is why I read that verse 9, where they're being told. In verse 9, Joshua and Caleb said, "Do not rebel, al timrodu." Do not rebel. And the verb marad literally means to be contentious, to be combative, to revolt. That's what it means. Don't be like this. Don't be contentious. Well, if disobedience against God's commandments is somewhere deep in your heart, if you live this life seeking to please yourself first and foremost, well, then the milk and honey, well, you may end up not with milk and honey, but more like with horseradish and pickles or something like that. That's just how it is. Sorry, but going against God's will, against his intentions that he's expressed, against what he teaches, will not bring you milk and honey. It just won't. You know, the wicked will prosper for a short time. You may look at some people and say, look at them, they're doing all the wrong things and still are okay. The wicked will prosper for a short time, but in the end, there's judgment, my friends. Don't worry. God is a God of justice. So, something that Joshua and Caleb also said, they also said, do not fear. So one thing is rebellion, fear. Al tirao, they said, do not fear. Fear is the absence of trust in Hashem. When we don't have faith, when we don't have trust, reliance on Hashem, we don't have that bitachon, when we're not sure if we're acting in line with God's will, well, then we should be fearful. If you're not sure that what you're doing is what Hashem wants you to do, you should be afraid. That is what we call yirat Hashem. That's the fear of God. The fear of us going against him, against his will. That's normal, that's good, it's healthy. But we should never fear or doing what is right, what Hashem actually tells us. And what we see in the story is them fearing to enter the land, which God specifically and expressly tells them to do. We should never fear to do what God said to do. So that applies to them and applies to us. So Joshua and Caleb, they premised their words. Joshua and Caleb premised everything they said, all these things that I've just been explaining to you, by saying, Im chafetz banu Adonai, if Hashem delights in us. So like everything I said now has a caveat. If Hashem delights in us. And that is the question, actually, that we should ultimately ask when we are in a sticky situation. When we stand in a pivotal decision in our life, when we have something that we're dealing with, whether we're struggling with some kind of a personal problem or anything really for that matter, we should ask this question. Is the Lord delighting in direction in which I'm going? Am I making this decision, is this what God would really want? Yeshua, our teacher, inspired us in a very radical way sometimes. His radical trust in following his Father. He said that everything that I do is because that's what my Father does. That's what he tells me to do. Everything. That's a very, radical way to live. It's hard for us to say everything we do is what God wills. But that's what the words that he inspired us with. So submission, my friends, is on the opposite side of rebellion. And does God's desire line up with what we are now considering is the question we should be asking? Is his will in us? Is he delighting in the direction in which we are considering to move? So my prayer for all of us, and myself including, as we rid our souls, that we would rid our souls of rebellion and fear and doubt, so that Hashem will truly delight in us, and we will see the land of milk and honey.